Like to introduce what the term gospel means, where it comes from. It's an English word, but it's based on a word that we actually see in the Gospels themselves. The English word gospel literally means good news, good message, good telling, and it's a translation of the Greek word that we see in the Gospels, euangelion. Eu, the epsilon upsilon at the beginning, is the prefix for good. And angelion is the word for message or news. In Greek, the A and then followed the alpha followed by gamma. Gamma is pronounced when two gammas come together. It's pronounced as if the first one is an N. And so you pronounce it angelion. We get our word angel from this. And angelos, or angel, is the one who brings the message. And then the angelion is the message itself. So euangelion is the good news. And it's associated with the sort of pronouncements that kings would have messengers proclaim throughout the empire when they had done something good or won a victory or something like that. So that's what the term means, and you can probably already tell it's a political term, and I want to give you a little background on the political background first before we look at how the term is adapted in our texts in the Gospels. To do this, a little quick history lesson. The Roman Empire had just gotten going at the time Jesus was born, and the first of its emperors who actually lasts on the throne for more than 3 years is Octavian. His uncle, sort of adopted grand uncle, Julius Caesar, was the first person to assume full leadership of the Roman Empire. It had been a republic, rotating the power between two members of the Senate every 2 years. They would sort of share power. The idea would be to avoid tyranny. But as the Roman Empire expanded and gained more power overall, the generals who won those victories began to assume greater and greater power. Julius Caesar eventually sort of overruled the others who were powerful with him and became the first emperor. But because he was the first of these, he was assassinated for his practices and policies by other senators jealous of his power. But his grandnephew eventually did the same thing, took over sole rule, and in the year 37 became the imperator, or leader of the full empire. And the proclamations associated with his rule that were adopted sort of throughout the empire are what I want to focus on here, because we happen to have found a wonderful artifact in Turkey. This is a Google map of Greece on the left and Turkey on the right. And where that red star is, right on the Aegean coast, we found a calendar inscription composed by the people of the town of Priene, and it was dated around the year 9 BCE. So already we're about 30 years, 28 years into the imperial rule of Octavian. We're well into his reign. And at this point, we find the citizens of this town of Priene dedicating themselves, demonstrating their loyalty to Octavian by this calendar inscription. Now, before I show you the calendar inscription, bear in mind that Octavian was had a special devotion to the god Apollo, the god of the sun, and often depicted himself with a sort of, we call it a halo, but the sort of aura or the nimbus around his head of the crown of sort of solar crown of Apollo. And so this association with Apollo was important to him. Well, what we find in the calendar inscription is that the Greeks in the town of Priene resolved to change their entire calendar. It had been a lunar calendar following the cycles of the moon, but they changed it to a solar one because that's the one that Augustus Caesar, with a special devotion to Apollo, the sun god, that's the calendar that he and the Roman Empire are now following. And so the Greeks of Asia resolved to reset their calendar to a solar calendar, and furthermore, to start their calendar to have as New Year's Day, the birthday of Augustus Caesar. So these are all demonstrations of their loyalty, their fealty to this new emperor. And in this line that I've highlighted up the top of this one tablet of the two tablets, we have in Greek this inscription. Since this is the reason, they're providing the reason for why they've done this. Since the birthday of the god was, and by that god they mean not Apollo but Augustus Caesar, so they're even referring to him as divine. Since the reason we're doing this is since the birthday of the god was the beginning of the good news for the world that came by reason of him. So they're calling what he has brought to the world, whether peace or stability or munificence of some other kind. They're calling all of that good news, and they're saying it came into the world by reason of him, and therefore they're changing their entire calendar to his birthday. And furthermore, they are acknowledging him as a god. So it's not just that they see his devotion to Apollo, but they believe him to be especially aligned with the gods too, and even to be a god himself. So that's the political background of this term, evangelion, or good news. When our gospel authors use it, it's not strictly a theological term or religious term. It's religious or theological and political, because the Roman emperor at the time was using this language of both his sort of political power and divine status. Both go together when the gods are seen as ultimately the source of all power. So this word, evangelion, that I've highlighted in red up there, that is our word gospel. Now, we have 4 Gospels in the Bible, but we know there's over 50 texts that call themselves Gospels. And intriguingly, a lot of them are biographies like we see in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that start roughly from some point in Jesus' life, perhaps his adulthood like Mark, or his birth like Matthew and Luke. John takes him back a little further to the beginning of time, but then they go through his death and, as we know, the resurrection, and in some cases the ascension. But there are other books that call themselves Gospels that aren't stories at all. For example, there's one, the Gospel of Thomas, that we'll meet in week 9. This is entirely composed of the sayings of Jesus. There are only about 2 or 3 very short narratives in there, like there's one healing story and the story of the centurion being healed, but there's very few stories, so almost entirely sayings, and that calls itself a gospel. There are other Gospels, and these are mostly among the Gnostic texts, that are sort of set up as special revelations, mostly post-resurrection. Jesus, the risen Jesus, reveals special new things to certain disciples. In the case of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, it's to Mary. In the case of the Gospel of Philip, it's Philip. And we know the Gospel of John is kind of like this too, though it's entirely set during Jesus, almost entirely set during Jesus's life in the flesh. So it's a little different from these other Gnostic Gospels that are set after the resurrection. But there are important resurrection appearances in John's Gospel too. Now, there are a couple Gospels that are entirely about Jesus' infancy. There's the infancy Gospel of James and the infancy Gospel of Thomas, which would be translated into Arabic and become influential in the pictures of Jesus' infancy in the Quran. In addition, we know of at least one gospel that's entirely the passion of Jesus, only the passion narrative. That's the Gospel of Peter. Now, in terms of the 4 that made it into the canon, these are not just histories or even biographies, the story of a life. They're calls, they're summons to the hearers to believe and to act in a certain way. And so they're a little more than just your standard history that was sort of trying to shape people's virtues or their memories of the past. These were about a call to believe and to act. Now, as you may know, we talked about this a bit on our first night. There are a couple of books like this Complete Gospels by Robert Miller that include the texts of a lot of these other Gospels I've been mentioning. The official sort of critical edition is the one on the left, New Testament Apocrypha by Wilhelm Schneemalker. There are 2 volumes of these, but the first one is the one that has Gospels and writings related to the Gospels. And in our 9th week, when you look at some of these Gospels, you'll pick one of them and take a look at it. The text from it is usually sourced from one of these 2 books, or if it's a Gnostic text, I've sourced it from one of these 2 compilations of the Gnostic material. And so you'll have a chance to look at those and read them yourself. They're widely available. So we've said that the Gospel, at least the 4 that are in the Bible, are more like biographies than they are history. This term bioi that you see up there is the Greek word for a biography. But I just want to develop some idea of the features that are characteristic here. Typical in ancient literature, there's little interest in character development. There's more of a sense that a person's character is sort of stable throughout their life, that they're sort of an essence of the person, and that doesn't really get affected during the plot. We just sort of see, or it's revealed what they're really like a little bit more and more. And that's very different from like a contemporary novel where so much attention is paid to the character. We're so interested in psychology in the wake of the development of psychology as a discipline. And so a lot of our contemporary novels focus more on character, but not so much in the ancient texts. Now, unlike a history, even ancient history, some of the tales we hear in the Gospels are more anecdotal. They're shorter stories, smaller episodes. And particularly in a book like the Gospel of Mark, there's less concern with cause and effect and a sort of building of the plot, though we may see some of that. The Gospels have a variety of social functions. They perform certain roles for the community. There is, of course, the literary artistry of them. They are a sort of propaganda as well, and I mean that in the best sense, where they're meant to be propagating a certain way of thinking that the author is devoted to. There's teaching, obviously. Literally, Jesus is teaching much of the time. In addition, the Gospels often provide a kind of defense that the Christian who learns the defense can use themselves in their debates with others or in their own thinking about their faith. This can help them understand it better and defend it against potential criticism. That's called an apologia in Greek rhetoric. Not really an apology like I'm sorry for something, but an apologia or defense in the classical sense. Also, a bioi, or one of these gospels, is also an encomium. That is another rhetorical form from the Greek world that's meant to praise the worthy person and by depicting how worthy they are, to foster emulation, that is, to encourage us to live like that person. Also, bioi typically, and the Gospel certainly, establish a kind of line of tradition and authorize certain persons in the author's present. And so we'll see that in the Gospel of Mark, for example, even though Peter doesn't always come off very well, he sort of stands out from the other disciples, and there's a sense in which he seems to be kind of the lead disciple. And so perhaps a line of tradition that's being supported by this Gospel of Mark is the line of tradition tracing to this particular disciple. I've been using this icon on some of our graphics for the class. It's the three images of, or three symbols of, the three synoptic gospels. The lion representing Mark, the human representing Matthew, and the ox representing Luke. These derive from visions of beasts that appear in Ezekiel and also in the book of Revelation. And of course, in both of those places, there's no reference to the Gospels particularly. But during the development of Christian iconography, those beasts, those figures, are associated with the Gospel authors. Mark, because of his reference to the reign of God and the royal character of Jesus, the association of the Lion of Judah with the Davidic king probably lies behind this association. Matthew's Gospel, which begins with the genealogy of Joseph back to Abraham, the focus on the human origins of Jesus, explains the human figure as the symbol of Matthew. And then we have Luke's Gospel associated with the ox. This is, some people have wondered if this might have to do with the animals present at the birth scene in the stable, but it probably more likely has to do with the sort of sacrificial significance of the ox as an animal that is sacrificed, and Luke's attention to the sacrificial system. His gospel begins with Zechariah in the temple, performing his priestly duties. The gospel ends with the temple as well, with the disciples going there to praise God. And we see this iconography all over Christian architecture and Christian art. Here is what's called the tetramorph, the four forms, the four figures of the Gospels. At the Church of Saint Trophime in Arles in France, we have Jesus surrounded by the lion of Mark at the bottom left, above him the human of Matthew. To the right is the eagle of John's Gospel, and underneath the ox of Luke. And of course, this is in canonical order, so from the upper left counterclockwise, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Here is the tetramorph again, this time at the beginning of the Gospels in the Book of Kells in Dublin. We can see again Matthew in the upper left corner, Mark the lion in the upper right corner, Luke the ox in the bottom left corner, and the eagle of John in the bottom right corner.